I would be interested to hear your take, because I know you've put this out into the open as to the nature of these political interventions by central banking institutions. What are the political influences that they have on economics and government, and why would these institutions do such a thing in the first place?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated, this issue. It's not really as simple and as black and white as some people want to make out, because effectively central banks, well, first of all, central banks can definitely take down governments, because the central bank, issues the money to the ATMs, and in extremis, if the ATMs are closed off, the government's not going to last very long. Now you say, oh, well, that's crazy. No, that's exactly what was threatened of Greece during the financial crisis, if you recall, when Alexis Tsipras and Yanis Varoufakis came in and opposed the Troika austerity programs. The threat was, we'll turn the ATMs off. So that shows you very clearly that central banks can get rid of governments, or they can put substantial pressure on governments to change their party line. Now, shutting down the ATMs is a little bit more extreme than what we're dealing with in the case of France and possibly the UK. But what they all share in common is that that it's because central banking is kind of a rules-based system, and because the rules are a little less clear than might be preferable, shall we say, it's possible to use these institutions, or not even to use them, just for these institutions to find themselves at an opportune moment where they can take a swipe at a sitting government. Now, I think that's pretty much what happened in the United Kingdom. Liz Truss came out and said she was going to do tax cuts. They were large but not extreme, I would say. I can't remember the exact number. I think it was 20-something billion was the total cost of the tax cuts. That was definitely much smaller than, for example, the energy price guarantee that was propping up, that was allowing households to afford the energy in the wake of the Ukraine war. And it was definitely a lot smaller than the spending on lockdowns. So just to put kind of the spending in context, those were two things that, let's just say, the economic establishment got on board with, which were much larger. And by the way, which have caused the most of the fiscal damage to the United Kingdom that the country is now experiencing. So it does seem to me that that a decision was made there effectively to say these were good deficits and that's a bad deficit. Also now, of course, they'll say, well, when we ran up those deficits with the lockdowns and then with the energy price guarantees, we didn't have as bad deficits, and now Liz Truss is coming in to put the bad deficits, on. But since then, the debt has climbed substantially more than Liz Truss's tax increases, and there's been no fiscal crisis. The fact of the matter is that the bond markets are not completely wedded to the central bank, but they're largely wedded to the central bank. And so if the central bank comes out and makes noises that it might not prop something up, as pretty much happened in the Truss case, it was the pension vehicles, if you recall, then the markets can freak out and a government can fall. So with the Truss case, I think it was opportunistic. I don't think that the Treasury and the central bank liked the tax cuts. I think they were put together by Truss and their Chancellor, and they weren't seen as wise. By the way, I'm agnostic on the cuts themselves. If you put a gun to my head, I'd probably agree with the Treasury and the central bank, to be honest. But this isn't just a question of specific tax cuts. It's a governance question, and they saw an opportunity to take a shot, and they did. The situation with the bank, with the French election, seems far more naked to me. The ECB has a history of political interventions. I just told you one with the Troika leaning in on the Tsipras government in Greece. I think it was 2015. I might have got the date wrong. And they pretty much, it was pretty mask off. They said, if Le Pen gets elected, all hell's going to break loose. And then I pointed out on Twitter, very ironically, that in the days afterwards, after the election, when there was a little bit of electioneering taking place, which people will say, oh, you're calling it fraud. No, I'm not. I'm just saying that parties made a deal to keep the right out. That's reported. Once that took place, it was the far left that basically looked like they had the upper hand initially, and markets calmed down. Now, the far left program included food price controls and so on. So, and not just food prices, I think. So it was much more extreme than the Rassemblement National Le Pen plan. But what was different was the ECB and, others weren't signaling that they'd cause trouble. So look, that calmed down. The Truss thing is over. But there is this kind of looming sense that the central banks are standing in the background, waiting to clamp down on anything they don't like. I'm actually a little bit concerned that something similar might take place in the United States. Of course, I'll just be clear, you do need some fragilities in the system in order for central banks to be able to leverage this power. But once those fragilities are in the system, and the fragilities are in the system because I would say very poor economic decisions that have been made in the past 5 years that are themselves giving rise to the populism that we're seeing, those fragilities are there, and the central banks, the same people who approved of these very poor economic decisions, in my opinion, are then responding to the social response and political response that's coming out of those decisions in a way that gives them an awful lot of control. So it's pretty sinister, I'd say, but it's also very dangerous because central banks shouldn't behave like this. When they start behaving like this, they start to lose their credibility. That's a whole different question, but I think these guys are skating on really thin ice.
Is it fair to say then that the read of this, and without sounding too Marxian about it, but it can be useful, is that there's a governing class who are protecting their own interests as a kind of Nietzschean will to power, that they're willing to make also Faustian pacts, this deal with whatever to remain in power in the face of challenges to their governing ideals, and also to make sure that they aren't effectively held to account for their mistakes. But I do find it disturbing if that is the case, because there's whether it's intended or not, the impact on those non-metropolitan classes who are most likely to be impacted by the downturns of which we've seen, particularly in a time when everyone's struggling because of those decisions, it keeps ratcheting it up. And so it's double-edged, well, not double-edged sword, it's this double takedown of the people who are effectively saying we don't want any more of this, and then in the attempts to hold on to power and legitimacy, they get slapped down again. Is that a fair take, or is that too much of a populist take?
No, I'd actually go one step further. I mean, to call in a kind of a philosophical reference, I don't know if you're familiar with Alistair MacIntyre and his book Virtue Ethics. Yeah, he talks about how the elite kind of, to use the Marxian term, the bourgeois, have this new sense of themselves as technocratic elite, and that everything has to be judged in terms of this kind of technocratic pseudo-ethics or whatever. And the justification for the technocratic pseudo-ethics is that it'll produce the most vibrant, rational, and prosperous society. So I think this is pretty much how this group that you're talking about sees themselves. I don't think they're capitalists in the old Marxian sense. They're more like the managerial elite, I guess, is like the old Burnham phrase, similar to what MacIntyre is talking about. So they're like a managerial elite who pride themselves on their technocratic competency. My issue isn't actually that in itself. I have some technocratic leanings myself, I guess, maybe not like ideologically committed to it. I have a life, but I understand like modern societies require some technocratic prowess. I'm a macroeconomist, but my sense is that these guys have lost the run of themselves. They're not actually very good technocrats anymore. A lot of the theoretical models that they approach the world with are really broken. I mean, everything from foreign policy to central bank monetary policy, all these things have kind of failed. And they don't have anything to replace them with. And they've boxed themselves in on their previous decisions. Like, take the spending, for example. The main contributions to the very large deficits we see across the Western world right now are the lockdowns and the energy price guarantees in the wake of the Ukraine war. Those are the biggest drivers. No one wants to reassess them. They don't want to talk about that. So it's like, shove that all under the hedge, right? We don't want to question those policies. We need to move forward. And so when they move forward, they see this kind of janky political system in front of them that's generated from their own policies. And their incentive is to double down. And what's actually very sad is there's a lot of people in this system who, although I may not agree with politically, I think were previously fairly competent technocrat types. And they actually had a sense of, reality, as it were, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And they seem to have lost that. And it's really strange. So just to give an example yesterday, Mario Draghi's paper on EU competitiveness has come out. We aren't going to talk about that, I know. But just to give you my high level take, it's rubbish. And it's full of complete nonsensical arguments that fly in the face of like undergraduate level competition economics, international trade economics, Ricardian, whatever, sorry, I should remember. But, how to maintain your competitiveness is subjecting yourself to free trade forces and so on. We can debate those things, sure, but like these are standard takes, and the Draghi thing is just like full of rubbish, and none of it's kind of argued or anything like that. So I think that's basically what's happened. The technocratic managerial elite have run aground, and they're dealing with a highly unstable political, economic, and geopolitical system, and they don't know what to do about it. So they're increasing, their authoritarian tendencies are increasing. But as you allude to, this will only produce more instability, and it'll be pretty horrible for the people living under it.